Hi all, it's Rachel. So today I want to go over the Jeffrey Cohen section of our Unit 1, which is his focus on 7 theses or 7 different arguments or lenses that we can use to read cultures through their monsters. So right now I'm looking at both the literary tool page as well as what I'm calling the sort of presentation, the PDF version of a presentation that I would give in an in-person class. And I toyed with this, but I kind of like the idea of having both up. So if this is a lot going on, you can always just listen to the audio and pull up whichever corresponding window works better for you than necessarily staring at your screen with me. Whatever helps. I just think this is such a rich part of our conversation that I wanted to give it the extra dimension of me talking through it. Sadly, it's not quite the same as having you here with me and, giving me your feedback in real time. We're going to do our best to capture that in the upcoming short stories, as well as in your essay 1, which look towards a video on that here in the near future. So remember, these both can be found under your material. I don't want to reset this because the screen is so tenuous, but under materials and content unit 1. And they should be after each other. In fact, I've got a link from this page over here on your left side of your screen to this presentation, right? You can also explore, if you click the access to the original source, I've already got that open to show you. This is taken from a real essay by Jeffrey Cohen from a larger work on monster theory called called just that. And it's phenomenal. It actually came out of the U of Minnesota Press, so another point of pride there. Very interesting stuff. It's a bit deeper and more dense than what we should have to necessarily encounter in English 1022, especially since you didn't all knowingly sign up to learn all about monster theory, even though you're going to quite a bit. But I thought I would have it here for my curious folks who might want to explore it further. But don't have to read this. That is just there for your consideration. However, I do want you to read this and consider this supplement over here on this additional page. So, what is the 7 theses? Well, Jeffrey Cohen is a pretty big deal in monster theory, and this is part of it's getting kind of older now, actually. It's had a lot of exploration done since, but it's still seen as a bedrock foundation from the mid-90s on how we use monsters. What are his main 7 thesis, right, argument on what the monster tells us about a culture. So I've broken them down here. Again, this comes from that larger essay, so feel free to peruse that if you would like. But you're welcome to simply reference the ideas for Cohen's theses from these 2 documents for the purposes of our class. And this will probably feel a little rushed because I like to keep these videos capped at 15 minutes. I might make a second, I don't know. I could talk about this forever, and if y'all were with me in a room, we could all talk about it, I imagine, for quite a while. So know that we're not doing its full justice. The first thesis that he lays out is monsters are cultural mirrors. They reflect the fears, values, and anxieties of the time in which they're created, right? So they're a product of their context. The examples I chose to put over here, and you'll notice you'll have sort of a bulleted list version of this. This should complement each other. I made them both, and these images. So we've got the 1930s Frankenstein, where the monster sees himself in a mirror. As a side note, please always note when a character in anything you read or watch observes themselves in a mirror, that suggests a moment of deep psychological reflection, even if you don't have monsters in the room. It's an important part of character development. So this is his realization, so to speak, of how he looks to the outside world, which can be very disruptive. And we know he's effectively haunted by that throughout the story in all versions. This is from Them, a mid-20th century sort of drive-in horror classic. Now, yes, that is a gigantic ant, and I realize for many of us that's not a primary concern. But remember that in the 1950s, early 1960s, nuclear bombs and atomic explosions were all the fear and rage, and there's a real concern that that kind of nuclear fallout or exposure could indeed cause enlarged things like terrifyingly gigantic ants who would then take over. So you can see it's not just the ant, the nuance of the ant, but rather the size of the ant and the implications of human science gone awry, causing this giant ant. So, unique fear of the time. Dracula, I couldn't resist another mirror image, and yes, that is a mirror image of the 1930s Bela Lugosi Dracula. Of course, if you know your vampire lore, you know that vampires are not capable of having the reflection in a mirror. All kinds of interesting social, cultural history of mirrors capturing souls or reflecting a soul. Does the vampire have one? Different cultures have concerns about being visually represented, photographed, or having, say, mirrors covered during a funeral. All of these things are so interesting, but in this case I couldn't resist because it's one hint to these individuals like, oh, there's a vampire here. There's a gentleman here, and yet he isn't in the mirror. That's strange. But also giving a moment of reflection to remind us the apprehensions that surrounded the creation of that book in the late 19th century. And frankly, some of the stuff that follows it forward are anxieties about racial, quote, mixing. Forgive me, I'm using air quotes. This is not my fear or concern, but I am articulating that the book was apprehensive at the time about Eastern European cultures, backgrounds, races, ethnicities, languages, you name it, being infiltrating British culture. This is at the height of the British Empire. So it's basically white racism from Western Europe. And also there's that sexual mixing of bloods component you can't discount when you talk about vampires. And that has been evoked in conversations about all kinds of relationships, from queer dynamics to HIV positive and AIDS communities. Lots of stuff with vampires. So, see, I'm already going too long on this. Building on that, they are representative anxieties of the moment, right? That builds on it. So they help us to know the context in which a monster was created, can tell us so much about the culture. And I've picked zombies for all three of these images because most researchers agree zombies are kind of the ultimate monster for our moment. They are mindless consumers, mobs of mindless beings, basically trying to consume your brain. You can probably fill in the gaps there. But yeah, I don't know if they still do it, but I remember they had zombie crawls on University of Minnesota campus when I was there for my grad program. I was in a class once, we looked out and there were people walking in a pretty big mob down the lane outside of, it was Lynn Hall at the time, making weird sounds and moving zombie-like. And I couldn't decide if it was cool or really weird, and maybe both, and a little scary, but not in a woo horror way, but kind of a wow, this feels kind of real. All right, and that was like a decade ago. Monsters as challengers of categories. I'm sure you guys have kind of gotten a sense of this already with Half-Hanged Mary and some of your other monster explorations so far. They can resist any set categorization. In fact, their definition is often that they lie somewhere outside of some normal thing. Right? So in that way, they're harbingers of crisis. They foretell something that's happening where people are realizing this category can't hold. No category, in fact, in any society, I dare say, is entirely ironclad or objective. They are socially constructed, and people know that on some deep level, and there's an anxiety or fear that those could be shattered. That is that urge to hold on to the traditional or lay claim to something that is familiar and fear the unknown. But I'm getting ahead of us here. They are hybrid beings, right? Monsters are in between. They're liminal. They're this and. They are too much or so-called too little in comparison to what a human existence is supposedly meant to be. And they do force us to question labels and meaning making. They show us how things are maybe not as ironclad as we thought. And that can be unsettling. Not only in a bad way, but unfortunately for a lot of people, change and unknown gets swept into being seen as bad without careful consideration. So moving from that, they can be gatekeepers of difference. By that, we mean they often represent the other, that capital O other, us versus them, right? A classic binary that unfortunately humans have long sort of held tight to in moments of fear. Anyone that's seen outside of that, they can be labeled a monster. Going back to Half-Hanged Mary, we can see some potential freedom in that, right? They can be seen as manifesting some cultural transgressions. I've given you some categories here, but you aren't limited to them. From the physical to the geographical to sexual to racial, I would add disability and embodied to that for sure, although that's kind of bound up in all of those as well. But unfortunately, obviously, the other side of that is that label of the monsters can be used as a kind of justification. Like, okay, you're somehow not fully human. Rachel is saying this with giant air quotes, by the way. Don't support this in any manner. But that is some sort of justification for the other. And that's why I have anywhere from Elphaba kind of laying claim to her monstrous quality and, defying gravity, to something really limiting and oppressive and frankly just straight up racist in this propaganda poster from World War I. That, by the way, those of you who did King Kong or are familiar with his lore should probably see some similarities. This actually predates that 1930s classic film and certainly the reference I made in the clip. But this is actually with the Kaiser helmet. It's categorizing World War I German soldiers as basically some kind of ape, right? Holding on to this white woman of liberty whose breast exposed. She's vulnerable. I mean, that could be Fay Ray all over again. And the club says culture. It's spelled in the German form. It's a little hard to see in this, but you can see it on yours. And you see he's standing on American words. And this is meant to encourage, at the time, young able-bodied men to enlist, to fight against that. So we are othering German soldiers in this category, well, in all words, right? The other gets dehumanized in propaganda frequently. And I wish I could say we were immune to this now, but we are clearly not. So it's something to keep an eye out for. Monstrous is a very cruel justification for mistreatment of other humans. They are the border patrol of the possible. So by now you finished your monstrum activity and you are aware that the word in monster comes from the same thing as in demonstrate, to warn. Monsters warn us. And I got the classic Little Red Riding Hood there because monsters often, such as the big bad wolf, make a presence in Western European fairy tales, for instance. Sorry, I got corgis going wild downstairs. It's probably just the male. To help children know sort of the limits of what's safety. Don't go wandering in the woods alone, right? It's seemingly simple as that. And then I have the image of the Garden of Eden and the serpent. It's very small, but of course that again, as a monster, is a kind of warning. And that narrative, having a kind of wisdom and intelligence that is supposedly not meant for humans, but is kept to God. And the serpent entices the humans to eat from the tree of knowledge, right? And break that boundary. So in some ways, they can be used by more conservative lines of culture to try to keep society static and prevent drastic change or shakeup of these categories. And that way, they are, much in this case, borders of knowledge. Monster as safety valve. All right. In this case, they can provide catharsis, a word you need to know. Certainly if you've read Greek mythology, you're familiar with it. A relief from repression, an escape from the limitations in our society. So they can be outlets for societal transgressions, and alternatively, they can restore order at its foil. And I provided some examples like Carnival, Halloween, Topsy-Turvy Day, instances where society is allowed to indulge in breaking boundaries. But even though it seems very freeing, know that it's always to do like, okay, this is a special occasion, you had your moment, now we're going to go back to order. We're going to reify those categories of order, which puts you back in your place. So I have the mob scene of Phantom of the Opera, right? Mob scenes are really big in these older horror films, and if you watch the clip I provided in the Nightmares from Red, White, and Blue, it was in fact enforced that all monsters had to die at the end of films regardless of their motive. So even if they weren't, quote, bad, they were villains to be killed so that order could be restored. Because frankly, that's a lot of the goal of these stories at the end of the day, through a conservative lens in particular, was to restore order, to reify, as I said, those boundaries that we have. Forgive me for skimming, just we're almost there. I don't want this to run out. A threshold of becoming. Monsters always return. They're consistent in human folklore and film. I mean, our oldest stories are about monsters, and as you've seen, they're prolific. We almost become immune to the fact that they're such a part of our everyday culture. They are our folklore, and they are always current in some capacity. They continue to bear a knowledge from the outside, and they force us to confront what it means to be human, to reevaluate that, because that's obviously not a static concept either. And what it looks like for us to be humans in this moment, monsters play outside and around with that, and we as people can reconfigure our own understandings. So we might reevaluate cultural assumptions, right? Those ideas we have, cultural fears, anxieties, what it means to be this or that, are in themselves shapeshifters. Who's at charge, right? Who's at the wheel here? Who decides what's monstrous and what's acceptable? And how have we seen that change over time? And as I've concluded, I'm sure you all know why I think it matters, but these stories help us talk more deeply about what it means to be human and engage in how this language, it's already among us and in our folklore. Why not be aware of it and take it to task and use it to our greatest ability? I hope this has helped y'all with this a little bit, and look for the video that will be out on the essay 1. Take care, guys.